as well. Okay, thank you. So welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. If you're in the UK, it's quite early, but I appreciate that for some people this is a much more convenient time. So just to quickly go through the agenda and what we'll be covering in today's session, it's a really packed agenda. We have a number of excellent speakers, so we'll try to have as much time at the end for discussion as possible. So we'll start off with some introductions to the group and then a review of our work to date, because the group is fairly well established at this point. Then we're moving into some implementation stories, so hearing from publishers about experiences of implementing the data policy framework that this interest group had produced. Then after that, we'll be hearing from two funders about utility and impact. So when publishers introduce strong data sharing policies, what kind of information is useful and what's available to other stakeholders like funders. And then at the end, we will have some time for discussion and hopefully some time to think about next steps for this interest group. So a couple of housekeeping things to draw your attention to. We do have a collaborative notes document. It's a Google Doc. I've created a short URL, so it's tinyurl.com/RDA policy IGP18. If that's easier, maybe Natasha or Ian could pop that link into the chat as well. So if you'd like to add to the collaborative notes, that would be great. But even if you aren't going to add to the notes, it would be really helpful if you could add your name to the attendee list. So we have no other way of knowing who was participating in the session other than if you add your name to the list. I've also set up a Jamboard for discussion ideas. So you might prefer to add your questions to the Zoom chat. And that's fine, you can do that as well. You might want to add questions to the collaborative notes, the Google Doc, if you'd like to. But I also set up a Jamboard, so we'll see how it works. You don't need to use it if you'd rather not, but you can do if you'd like. Again, I have the URL, so it's plenary 18 Jamboard. And I'll show you how that would work. But before I do, just to note, the session is being recorded. So the recorded session will be available via the Whova platform for, I think, the next month. And then after that, it will be available on the RDA's YouTube channel. So just keep that in mind, that the session is recorded. So if you did want to add to our Jamboard, and I'm interested to see how this works, basically it's a whiteboard where you can add sticky notes. So I've just added 3. And you can grab those and start typing into them if you'd like to. If you want to add new sticky notes, you can see on the left-hand side, I have an arrow pointing at the button that will let you create a new note. It's handy for, I think, if there's kind of a discussion taking place over time, it can be helpful to like group questions together to start to see themes emerge. But as I said, if you'd rather type into the Zoom chat, then you're welcome to do that either. So I thought we should start with a round of introductions. So obviously we're the Data Policy Standardization and Implementation Interest Group. I think 3 of the chairs are here this morning. So to introduce myself, I'm Rebecca Grant. I'm Head of Data and Software Publishing at F1000. I've been co-chair of this group, I think, for about 2 years now. Previously, I worked at Springer Nature, and some of my work involved looking at implementing our policy framework across Springer Nature journals. So I'll hand over to Ian to introduce himself.
Hello, everybody. Ian Fonaskiewicz. Nowadays, I'm Director Open Research Solutions at PLOS, but more importantly for today, I, with Natasha and others, co-founded this group back in 2017, collaborated with the other co-chairs and Rebecca more recently on the Research Data Policy Framework, and have been working with stakeholders, funders and publishers in particular to see it being implemented more recently. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. And Natasha?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Natasha Simons. I'm the Associate Director for Data and Services at Australian Research Data Commons, and we build data infrastructure in Australia, and as part of that, we've done work with the publishers around standardising the journal data policies here, and that will unfold through the course of this session.
Great, thanks, Natasha. Sorry, I'm so bad at Zoom, couldn't unmute. So I think Simon and Azar are not at the meeting this morning, so we'll move on. So handing back to you, Natasha, and I'll drive your slides. Just let me know when you want me to move forward.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Rebecca. So just to give you a bit of background on this interest group, I think some of you will have been to our sessions before, so this is just a brief recap on where the interest group started and where we have got with our work in this group. So this all started back in 2016 at Plenary 8 in Denver, Colorado. And the picture there is of the bear trying to get into the convention center where the RDA was held, because our session was sort of rogue birds of a feather session in that it wasn't on the agenda for that plenary. However, RDA did what RDA does best, which is get people together who are of a similar mind, trying to solve similar challenges in data. And Ian was one of those people who sort of galvanized a bunch of people to get together who were interested in the journal data policy landscape and the fact that it was so diverse and difficult and how we might solve that problem. So that is the origin of this interest group, and we've progressed from there. So if you just move along, Rebecca, please, to the next slide. Okay, so the rationale for our group was that there was quite a lot of different funder policies, and more funding agencies and institutions were introducing research data policies, and publishers want to comply with those policies. And it was creating quite a confusing, out of kilter landscape, and very difficult for researchers to navigate, and publishers as well. So the next slide, please, Rebecca. So there were more funder policies, but there are even more journal data policies. And then, in fact, the landscape was so confusing that JISC in the UK had tried to build a journal data policy registry and gave up on the idea because the policies were just so different that they couldn't build that registry. Even concepts like, sharing the data was just open to discussion. What data are you actually asking me for? And it's a very confusing landscape for all the players in research, for all of the stakeholders. And we wanted to tackle that first because our group involved publishers. Ian was then at Springer Nature, now at PLOS. And we had publishers involved in this group, and it was a good place to start to make a lot of impact. So that's what we started with. And next slide, please. Okay, so we formally formed the group, and we've already gone through the co-chairs. And the way we went about it was to say that we would build on the activities that JISC had already started in looking at that registry, build on the activities that the ARDC, my organisation, formerly called ANS back then, actually had done work with journal editors around this as well, and particularly the work that Ian was doing in Springer Nature and that Simon was doing in Wiley Publishers as well. So next slide, please. So we started with, we carried out a consultation and community engagement to develop a framework of standard policy features and types. And we did that through open calls in both the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. Over a period of probably a couple of years, we did those, and we had repeated sessions at plenaries. We invited a lot of different people to participate in the writing of this framework, looking at all the features that were needed. And next slide, please, Rebecca. And this was the output. So we came up with 14 policy features and 6 policy types. So the features that you can see on the left there are things like what to do with supplementary materials, data repositories, data citation. These are all the features that you would need, because even if a publisher has a policy, it's usually up to the journal editor to implement that policy. That's been one of the challenges here, is that can be an issue. So a lot of editors didn't get started because they weren't sure where to start or what to include in a policy, and that is what this addressed. And you can see it's divided up into the information that's required and whether there's information and action required or it's not applicable at all. Next slide, please, Rebecca. And then those policies, those existing policies from Springer Nature, Wiley policy, etc., were mapped to the framework as well. So it didn't come out of the blue. It clearly built on the work that was already out there and just expanded on that work, really. Next, Rebecca, please. Okay, so here's an example of one of the features that we came up with on data repositories, and you can see that there's a definition of that feature that shows you why you would want to include that in a journal data policy, and then there's a template text that journals can use to provide their authors with information around that policy feature. The next slide, please. Thank you. And we published the framework in the data science, the Codated Data Science Journal, and you can download that. It's got a DOI on it, and you can download that and have a read of it at your leisure. Next one, Rebecca. And we also have it, it's now a RDA supported output formally. So they've got this nice little card actually on the RDA website that explains, you know, what the challenge was that we were trying to solve and what the solution was that we came up with. And they've got a little bit there on the impact too. So if you want to have a read of that, you can just go on the website to find that. But I'm very pleased that it's a supported output of Research Data Alliance. Next slide, please, Rebecca. And here are some impact and adoption examples. We have a lot more, but here are some of the examples. So the scientific data journal from Springer Nature plus all PLOS journal policies are updated to align with the framework and also include DMP feature as well. We had a collaboration with the STM Association, which if you have been involved in this group in previous plenaries, you would have heard the presentations from STM on promoting the policy adoption to 150 of their member publishers. And we also had a talk, I think it was at the last plenary, would have been the plenary before, on the Slovenian scientific journals who also implemented the framework and talked about the results that they had in doing that. So we're now at a point, next slide please, Rebecca. This is just my last slide, that we are looking now at the funder-publisher alignment, which we'll talk about later, but we're collaborating with the funders interest group and the Fair Sharing Registry on aligning funder and publisher policy, because it's very tricky if publishers are asking for one thing and funders are asking for something else. So we really need to align those, and we have a project to do that and a collaboration to do that, which is wonderful. So that's sort of our next step in the process. So that really brings us up to where we are today, and I will hand it back to Rebecca. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Natasha, for that overview of our work to date. Now I think we're going to move into our guest speakers. So I believe we're starting with Lauren from PLOS. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Lauren get set up. Just to note for anyone who's joined, we are going to have a discussion session at the end. If you want to add questions to the chat, you can do so. You can add discussion topics to the Jamboard. Also at the end, we will let people raise their hands and unmute if you'd rather speak than type. So Lauren, I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Lauren Cadwalder. I am the Open Research Manager at PLOS. For those of you who don't know PLOS, we're a non-profit open access publisher, and our mission at PLOS is really driven by the desire to make research communication more open and transparent. And so, yeah. It really kind of sits on top of what we refer to as 3 pillars, that we want to empower researchers. We want to break boundaries in terms of kind of pushing research forward and sharing research faster and increasing global participation. And we want the research to be trusted. And so kind of taking all of these together, it really makes sense that PLOS has an open data policy, because open data as well as open science in general speaks to all of these pillars and really helps push our mission and what we're trying to achieve at PLOS. So a very brief history of the data policy at PLOS. We launched our first journal way back in 2003 with a really kind of open mission. You may know that the kind of founders of PLOS have written an open letter. It was signed by many academics across the globe. So we launched with PLOS Biology as an open access publisher. And then it wasn't until 2014 that we introduced our mandatory data sharing policy. Until that point, it was a kind of encourages data sharing policy. And then if we look forward to what we're doing now, we're now starting to kind of push our work in open science practices forward and really kind of seeing how we can kind of take things like our data policy as well as other open science practices further forward to help with PLOS's mission around open science and making research more equitable and accessible across the globe. So our kind of data policy in a real nutshell is that all research articles must provide a data availability statement in a structured way. So when researchers are submitting their manuscript in Editorial Manager, there is kind of clear guidance of how they should structure their data availability statement. And it kind of gives example statements and they kind of fill in the blanks with DOIs and accession numbers, that kind of thing. And data must be shared unless there's a legal ethical restriction that applies. So the kind of options that researchers have when they're sharing their data and what to write in their data availability statement is data is shared in this repository and here's the DOI, or data is shared within the paper or the supplementary information, or that data cannot be shared due to ethical or legal restrictions. Please contact so-and-so, we'll see here for further details. So they're the kind of three kind of broad options that we allow in the data sharing, data accessibility statement. And on the kind of other end, the kind of more journal side of the data availability statement and policy, it takes our editorial operations team on average about 20 minutes to check the data availability statement. So what they're looking for is, firstly, is there a statement? Does it contain a link? Does that link resolve to something? And then finally, they do a check to see if the data contains any kind of sensitive information that really shouldn't be shared. So for the vast majority of papers, that's a really simple process, very straightforward. But of course, there are some papers that aren't as straightforward, or the link is missing or it doesn't resolve. And that's perhaps because the person's uploaded their data to a repository, but it's under embargo until the paper's been accepted or published. So it's just ensuring that those links work, so that at publication, when we publish the article, that those links definitely resolve and the data is accessible. And then in the more technical side, the data availability statement is incorporated into the article XML. So we present that information in a structured way when the article is kind of presented on the screen, which means it's more useful in terms of information sharing and information kind of mining. So there are a number of benefits, we think, to our data sharing policy and the way that we present our data availability statements. First of all, the kind of obvious one that makes data available to researchers, and that's good for things like peer review, so that they can look at the data whilst reviewing the article. It means the data is available for reuse, reproducibility, etc., etc. I'm sure we're all really familiar with the kind of benefits of data sharing. And then secondly, the use of the XML and that structured data availability statement allows us to track where data is being shared. So we do like a text mining of our data availability statements, and that allows us to kind of work out where the data is being shared, which allows us to see kind of patterns of data sharing within certain journals or certain communities. And I've put a graph in here of where data is being shared in those kind of broad categories of supplementary information: a generalist repository, something like Figshare or Dryad or Zenodo; a specialist repository, so those are the discipline-specific ones; or statements that say data's not been shared for ethical legal restrictions. And we can see that in 2014, most people are using supplementary information. And you know, imagine that's because people are very familiar with that way of sharing data, and so it's quite a kind of natural, I think, way to share data if you're not used to it, especially when you're kind of uploading your manuscript. And we can see that that number is dropping off over time to last year, and the use of repositories is increasing, which I think we'll all agree is a good thing. And because we put our data availability statements in the articles in this way, and we can kind of mine that information, it also will enable funders and institutions to monitor what researchers are doing with their data, kind of in a similar way to sort of how we're looking at the data internally. And we know this is really important from some work we did at PLOS last year, and Ian and I released a preprint earlier this year, looking at the needs that funders and institutions have for understanding researchers' open research practices. And actually, they really do want to know what researchers are doing with their data. Are they making it available? And if not, why not? So simply having a line like data available on request doesn't help them understand why that data isn't being shared. Is it due to ethical and legal restrictions, or is it because the researchers don't want to share their data? So by having these kind of more standardized statements and presenting in the XML, it would hopefully allow funders and institutions to better monitor what people are doing with their data, and then help them understand the data sharing landscape and the kind of value they're getting from their grants. And then finally, it allows us to see where we can make progress next in terms of open science. So what is next? I hear you all crying. Well, at the moment, we've just started a project to learn more about how to incentivize data sharing. So this is some work funded by the Wellcome Trust Open Research Fund. And we've got three kind of broad strands. The first, we're looking at, can we increase the use of repositories over supplementary information? So that graph I showed earlier, we've still got around 63%, I think, of papers using supplementary information. And whilst we think author choice is very important, that we don't want to kind of dictate to our authors what they have to do with their data, we do want to encourage best practice. So we're looking at how can we kind of gently nudge researchers towards using data repositories. So we've started a pilot with PLOS Pathogens, which is integrated with the Dryad repository, so that researchers can use that upon submission. So instead of clicking upload my files to supplementary information, they just click Dryad instead. And we hope that that will encourage researchers to use repositories. The second strand is working out whether more prominent links on articles saying this paper has data in a repository would get more people to share via a repository. So we're looking at kind of do visual kind of like badges or buttons help incentivize data sharing in a repository, and actually how does that also help readers of articles engage with research data? And then finally, the third strand will be some community engagement work to try and better understand the attitudes of the different communities we're working with towards data sharing and using repositories, and what kind of solutions work best for them, and if they don't work, why don't they work? And then finally, I just wanted to give a quick example of going even further with kind of data sharing policies, and that's looking at actually a code sharing policy that we launched in PLOS Computational Biology earlier this year in March. Of course, we all know like code and data are very closely aligned, so I think it's quite a natural next step for having a mandatory code sharing policy. Now we have a data sharing policy, but of course we have to make sure we implement it with due diligence. So this was really a community-driven initiative, which is excellent to see that the computational biology community wanted to share more code, and we saw them already sharing a lot of code. And so we decided that actually this is a fairly low risk policy to implement. So we implemented at the end of March. We haven't seen any impact on submissions. And compared to the 2020 figures, the use of GitHub has gone up from 31 to 41%, and the use of supplementary information has decreased. And I think that's these are kind of just the snapshot figures that I have to look at in more detail. But I think it's really interesting to think about how other policies might positively impact on things like data sharing policies. So is it supplementary information down because more people are putting their code and data together in GitHub rather than sharing, say, their data and supplementary information? And so I think this is a nice example of how we shouldn't be afraid to kind of push forward with policies that we might be feeling a little bit nervous about. But actually in certain communities, they're, I think, quite an obvious and easy thing to do. So a couple of concluding thoughts, just that data sharing benefits multiple stakeholders, and especially when presented by a publisher in a structured way that can be reused by others. It gives publishers the opportunity to learn more about the communities they serve, and then hopefully in turn they share those outputs, and we'll be sharing the outputs from our Wellcome funded research so that others can learn as well. And we shouldn't be afraid to kind of push certain communities forwards in terms of sharing data if they're already making their work open. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Lauren. That was really interesting. What struck me was what you were saying about the structured data availability statements and the use of XML. So like, I think it's something that can be quite challenging to identify, like what exactly have these authors done, especially at scale, like what methods are they using. So thank you so much. I will turn now to Jade. Just to say, while Jade gets set up, I can see people are adding notes, sticky notes to the Jamboard, so please continue to do that if you like. Yeah, thanks, Ian. Jade, have we lost you?
No, I'm just about to share my screen.
Thanks.
Can everybody see that?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent, thanks. And thanks, Rebecca. So I'm Jade and I'm a managing editor at IOP Publishing. And today I'll be talking about the introduction of our data availability statement at IOP Publishing and the effect this had on our authors and editorial teams. So in 2019, we were aware that several other STEM publishers had introduced such policies like PLOS and the impact it had on their editorial processes. So we were keen to pilot this at IOP Publishing prior to a full rollout. The presentation covers the details and results of the pilot study which we ran, which alongside my co-authors Andrew Walker and Phil Jones was published earlier this year. Phil is also speaking currently at the All About Persistence breakout, but it's also being repeated next week. So the pilot began in 2019, which seems a very long time ago, on 3 open access journals. So 1 established open access title, Environmental Research Letters, and 2 of our new launches, Journal Physics, Complexity and Machine Learning Science and Technology. So after consultation with the editorial boards, these journals were chosen due to the expectations of the community. We felt these communities were either using large data sets or data sharing practices were already somewhat established. And for ERL, we were also keen to put our environmental series of journals at the forefront of open science. And it's also got transparent peer review, and a lot of our open science trials go to ERL first. As a publisher, we were committed to open science or are committed to open science. And one of the aims of the pilot was to discover how to best operationally implement these policies, and not if data availability statements had a place on our journals. We knew we wanted to implement a policy. We just wanted to know how best to do that. During the pilot, authors were asked on submission of their revised manuscript to select one of 5 options and also include a written statement within the manuscript. So the options ranged from the data is fully available to no new data was used in the paper. Failure to include a written statement would result in the editorial team unsubmitting the manuscript, so effectively returning it back to the author to add this information. Using the Carina Workflow Intelligence software, we were able to capture a baseline of the 2 areas we wanted to measure. So the unsubmission rate of revised manuscripts, which would show us if authors were understanding the new policy requirements. And secondly, the time taken to process each revised submission for our editorial staff. The baselines for each were taken from the 2 months prior to the implementation of the policy. And the data collected in the 2 months following implementation are shown in 2 categories. So we had an initial phase and then data collected after mitigation steps had been introduced. Before the trial, fewer than half of the revised manuscripts were being unsubmitted, showing that authors generally understood the requirements for submitting their revised manuscript on these journals. During the initial phase, the number of revised submissions being unsubmitted increased due to authors selecting the data availability statement, but not then putting it in their manuscript. And we can see this on the graph as the number of manuscripts never unsubmitted decreases from the baseline. So working with staff and journal editors, we introduced several initiatives during the pilot to hopefully reduce the impact of the policy. These included adding information to the decision email, as well as adding dedicated reminders to authors about including the statement during their revision period, just increasing the visibility and signposting of the policy. We also added clearer information on our author and reviewer guidelines on our publishing support website. We hope these steps would increase author awareness of the policy and mean that more manuscripts were submitted with this requirement. And we saw good results, with fewer manuscripts needing to be returned to the authors in the mitigation phase of the pilot. So we knew that it had an effect, and we were able to measure that really quickly. We knew asking staff to make additional checks on all revised manuscripts would increase the time it took them to process each paper. For processing times, we saw a change in the distribution of the average time between manuscripts processed prior to the pilot and those after. While we only saw a small increase in the median total times, the upper quartiles are extended upwards on that initial phase, suggesting that the number of problematic articles may have gone up. And this is most likely due to the additional checks on certain types of data statements. So if they've provided a DOI, checking that the link worked, if the data was included in the manuscript, making sure that it was. And there was definitely a lack of knowledge from staff and increased back and forth with authors to resolve queries. So as well as the mitigation steps to increase author awareness, we reinforced staff training of the policy. And as they became used to introducing the checks into their existing processes and their knowledge grew, we saw processing times reduce, and at the end of the pilot, we're close back to baseline levels, which was positive to see. You can read the full results of the pilot in Learned Publishing. The article is open access, and the data collected during the pilot is also available. So what did we learn from the pilot? Well, with the lessons we took fell under 3 key areas. From authors, we had no negative feedback during the pilot about the policy itself, and it was largely positively received across the communities of the 3 journals. We did see a lot of queries and confusion about how to construct a data availability statement. Most of them had never done that before and didn't know how to construct it or write it. And we did provide examples on the publishing support website, but we still had a lot of back and forth with authors about how to do this, not necessarily why, but how to construct a statement. So we knew going forward that we wanted to try and reduce this burden on authors and possibly eliminate this through automation. But it wasn't at a complete loss, because it was actually through some of these queries that we found new use cases for statements that we currently didn't offer on the submission form. And so we have introduced and tweaked the statements since the pilot to accommodate these scenarios. While the manual process allowed us to publish data availability statements successfully in the 3 pilot journals, it remained operationally complicated and resource intensive for our staff, and often resulted in a lot of back and forth with authors. And while the process worked, it was still manual, very much led by staff checking statements were included and matched what was on the submission form. It meant it was open to human error, inconsistencies, as well as, like I mentioned, operationally intensive. It was working well for 3 journals, but to roll out across our entire portfolio of journals, which was our aim and our hope, we learned was just not viable. So we decided to automate the process. And to achieve this work, we had to develop all our key systems and work closely with our production suppliers to manage instructions. And although the project was driven by policy, the implementation was operational, and we initially underestimated the complexity of the systems and cross-functional elements required, which did delay rollout, which, you know, from 2019 first to now, it took us until March this year to implement an automated process. But I'm pleased to say that we've completed rollout of an automated mandatory data availability statement on all IAP-owned journals. In the updated process, authors still choose the data availability statement that best applies to their manuscript at submission. The metadata of this question then feeds through to our production system at acceptance and is added to the manuscript during typesetting of our suppliers. This means authors no longer have to manually add a statement to the revised manuscript, but they do have the opportunity to check and complement the statement if they wish to do so once they've received their proofs. And then the structured data availability statement is then present in the final version of record. There is a trade-off with the process, and that is that authors who are routinely sharing and used to creating data statements have slightly less flexibility with a structured approach, but we do see and allow them to make some changes in their proof corrections. From starting with the pilot and what we were able to learn, we believe that the efficiencies of the automated process outweigh this drawback. While we automated the process, mandated data availability statements remained on the 3 pilot journals in the kind of 2-year period. We also put the policy and process in place on all new open access journals launched since 2019. And we brought in a more comprehensive data policy for the authors. So in that interim period of 2 years, we had a policy across all IOP journals that encouraged but not mandated data availability statements, with the exception of a handful of titles. And the aim of the automation was to be able to move all our journals to a mandatory data availability statement with minimal input for staff or authors. So we did that in 3 phases. So firstly, we moved all the existing journals with an automated with the mandatory statement requirements, and then 2 subsequent batches of journals depending on the production supplier who had to be briefed and instructions set up. So the process as it stands today allows standardization of data statements, enabling us to build reports about uptake and learn more about the levels of data sharing in our communities. Those will then inform our policy and author information depending on the results and where we might strengthen the policy going forward. One of the things that we're interested in is, does having a policy increase data awareness and data sharing, for example? And we're currently building a baseline of our authors and hope to see data sharing increase over time to see whether policies have an influence over author behaviour. And in particular, we want to see whether repeat authors change what they put in their manuscript and whether they share their data because of the policy that we've put in place. The data in the graph is up to the beginning of Q3 this year, so we've not gathered much data yet, but in articles accepted during this time where new data is produced or analysed, we see 55% of articles have made their data immediately available, either through providing a DOI to a repository or in the manuscript or supplementary files. It means 45% of articles are not sharing their data or sharing it after a delay, but for the physical sciences, we think that's a really good starting figure. And it's too early to draw significant conclusions, but when we do look at this data at a journal level, we are starting to see some differences in disciplines between our journals, with kind of more computational and environmental communities sharing their data immediately, and it gives us an indication of where we could introduce new policies or strengthen the policies in the future. So being able to measure the impact using the Carina workflow intelligence software enabled us to kind of quickly recognise the impact of the pilot and make iterative improvements while it was still ongoing. And it informed our initiatives and next steps and gave us insight into the viability and benefits of a full rollout of a manual process versus an automated one. During doing the pilot, in the first place, gave us invaluable insight into how best to implement open data policies in a structured way, and enabled us to design a process that worked at scale so that we could successfully mandate data availability statements across all IOP-owned journals and support data sharing across the physical sciences. Thanks very much. Excellent. Thanks so much, Jade. That was really interesting and insightful. I can see, again, we have some questions coming in on the Jamboard. So if you did have questions for Jade, please do add them to Jamboard, or you can add them to the chat on Zoom if you prefer. Now we're going to turn over to Yasushi. So I'm going to share my screen again because I'll be sharing the slides.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. And while you are all okay, you share the screen.
Okay, so the slides are up. So yeah, just let me know when you want me to advance.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Yasushi Ogasaka from Japan Science and Technology Agency, and thank you for inviting us to this session. I am in charge of the one of the funding program in JST. So I view this topic from the funding people's viewpoint. And my co-author is called Nakajima, and she is a director of the department that manages the open science policy for the agency. So she may view this topic as a from the regulator's point of view. So we are happy to answer any questions you might have. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about our open science policy and how we have implemented the data management plan into the funding programs in JST. And then I will talk about a very quick study of a relation between DMP and the availability statement in manuscript in a context that if there is any better way to for the data management. Next slide, please. So about JST open science policy and implementation of data management plan. Next slide, please. So very quickly, JST is one of the National Research and Development Agency under the Ministry of Education, Culture, Sports, Science, and Technology. JST is known as one of the funding agencies in Japan, but there are other businesses such as research planning, public engagement, or information services. But about 80% of the budget goes to R&D funding, so it's the main business. Just some numbers, we award about 600 projects every year as a new project. And also the projects produce about 6,500 articles per year on average. Next slide, please. So we have introduced the agency-wide open science policy 4 years ago. It came effective April of 2017. There are three pillars in this policy. One is the open access policy. So we now mandate the open access of the articles funded by JST programs. And the second pillar is data management plan. So our fund recipient have to submit the data management plan. So it's a mandate. And third one is the data publication. So we recommend to make the so-called evidence data public. So it's not a mandate, but it's recommended. So these are the three main contents of the JST's open science policy. So far we have we implemented these policies into the funding programs in JST. But honestly speaking, we do not think that the compliance rate is 100%. So we have some issues. So next slide, please. Okay, so I would go through how we have implemented the data management plan into the funding programs. So 1 year prior to the implementation of the agency-wide policy, which is in 2016, we introduced the data management plan into one of the funding program as a pilot. So at that year, the 13% of all newly awarded projects submitted DMP to JST. Then in 2017, when we started introducing the policy to all the funding programs, 33% of newly awarded projects submitted DMP. And then by 2018, all the funding programs adopted DMP. And as a result, 97% of newly adopted, awarded projects submitted DMP to JST. And remaining 3% are the projects exempt from DMP mandates, such as a program for startups and et cetera, et cetera. So And one thing I should note here is that researchers are required to submit DMP after the projects were awarded and before the funding starts. So they submit the DMP as a part of the the project plan, and which is a subject of approval by the program officers. So next, please. And just quickly explaining what is the content of the DMP. So this is the actual sheet of the data management plan that we ask researchers to fill. So there are four contents. One is the list of data sets with information such as name, brief description, category, level of data availability, whether it's an open, close, or limited sharing. And then there's a policy on preservation management or publication sharing. And third item is a expected use case of published or shared data. And the fourth one is the plan of promotion of data reuse. So researchers fill the sheet and submit this to the program officer for their approval. Next slide, please. So I will show you just the overview of what is written in DMP. So the pie chart on the left shows the distribution of the level of openness that they write in the DMP. So the level 1 is the close. So they do not intend to make those data publicly open. And then level 2 is the so-called limited sharing among the fellow researchers or the sharing upon request. And level 3 is the open. So they plan to make the data publicly available at some point. And also we learn from those DMP that the place to store data is mostly storage in the laboratory or the university department. And also they state that the preservation period is mostly 3 to 5 years. And for the data that they don't intend to make open, there are reasons for non-disclosure, such as the privacy concerns and restriction by the cooperative research contract. And also it belongs to the corporate secret or other confidentiality. So this is the overview of the DMP. So next slide, please. So as we were invited to this session, we did some very quick analysis of the DMP and data availability statement of the articles that were funded by our program. So next slide, please. So the purpose of implementing DMP is to establish proper data management by fund recipients, although it has not been achieved yet, we think. So while DMP is a plan, data availability statement is kind of a result or output of the data management. So in this context, DME covers all data produced from the project, while data availability statement is for the data related to the research article. And also the data availability statement can possibly describe relation between research findings and data, while DMP describes the relation between research plan and data produced. So it's kind of a complementary relation to each other, I think. So to seek for possibility to utilize data availability statement in data management in some way, we studied some small sample of funded articles and looked into the data availability statement as well as the corresponding data management plan of the funded project. So next slide, please. So, okay, so we picked up one funding program and which is called JST Mirai program. And the feature is shown here as well. So there are about 2,100 funded articles published in the past 4 years. So we just arbitrarily extracted 20 articles published in PLOS journals and looked into the data availability statements. So next slide, please. So this is the results. So from the 20 articles or 20 data availability statements, 14 of those says the data is in the manuscript. And half of those did have a raw data in the let's see, in the supplemental materials. 5 of those had the data, but it was not raw data. It's some kind of a table numbers of, or those data. But interestingly, 2 of those, I could not find any data in the manuscript. And 5 data availability statements said that the data is in repository, and 1 article did not disclose the data due to privacy concerns. Then I looked into the contents of the corresponding data management plan and see that the significant fraction of those data were actually not described in the data management plan. And other data are stated as closed or limited sharing in the data management plan. So it's quite interesting to see. So next slide, please. So what we learned from this very quick and easy analysis, the data availability described in data availability statement and data sharing policy described in the DMP do not match in many cases. But this might be because at the time of writing DMP, the researchers only have a vague idea on how they publish articles on which data. So it may be natural. Now, the many data described in the data availability statement are in fact not described in data management plan. So, well, again, this might be natural because DMP is a plan. And so it tends to be an abstract, while data availability statement is a very specific thing. So it could be natural. Now, many of the raw data in the supplement or repository, so in other words, it's open data, were actually described as a level 1 closed or level 2 limited share in the data management plan. So it is emphasized that the closed data had become public by publication of article. So it's also interesting. So next slide, please. This is the final slide, conclusion. So for better data management, data availability statement can provide with information on how data are made public available. So in other words, it's a consequence of data management. So maybe compiling data availability statement and linking them with DMP could help monitoring data management of publication status. But this needs enhancing machine readability of article metadata, such as funding information, acknowledgement, as well as data availability statement. It's not only machine readable, interpretable. I had to read all the data availability statement in the article, and it was kind of hard time. Now, in this context, in the manuscript data availability statement that was not easily read. I mean, it was kind of hard to understand. Now, the question arises: is the data availability statement format uniform across journals or publishers? So that might need to be harmonized from our perspective. However, I think we learned that the presence of data availability statement and that the policy behind it could encourage researchers to make that data publicly available, which align with the funding agency's mission. So this is all I want to say. Thank you for listening.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Yasushi. I think something that I'm picking up on across the presentation so far is this theme of how do you allow authors to create a data availability statement that is accurately describing their data sharing. So you need to be flexible, but also to allow us to interpret in aggregate what these authors are doing. And I had some more questions, so I'm going to add those to the Jamboard. Okay, so now we're going to turn to a presentation from Jeremy Gillen from CIHR, and using the magic of Zoom technology, I think Ian is going to stream his recorded talk through Zoom.
Yes,
Get that set up again.
I'm gonna share my video and or share a video via Zoom. So we did practice this earlier, so with the power of technology, we should now hear Jeremy Gillen's talk. If I cloud, can you hear that?
Not yet.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jeremy.
Did you hear the start of it? Okay, cool. I will begin Jeremy's talk. It's about 12 minutes.
Jeremy Gillen. I'm a senior advisor at the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, where I work on open science policy, development and implementation. Today, I'm going to be speaking to you, giving my own perspective from a funder's point of view on the impact of journal data policies. But before I begin, I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm giving this presentation from Ottawa, which is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe peoples. So just to begin, I wanted to give a brief, really brief overview of kind of the policy landscape as it pertains to data sharing. I'm sure as many in the audience know, in recent years, various policies, frameworks, and agreements are related to the promotion and support of research data sharing have been developed at the international, national, and regional levels. So for example, at the international level, just this year, the OECD released a revised version of its recommendation on access to data from public funding. That was originally drafted in 2006, revised this year. Canada is a member of the OECD. And of course, another key international policy document, not relating specifically to data and data sharing, though it's relevant to data policy, I think, is of course the Declaration on Research Assessment, DORA. CIHR signed that declaration in 2019. At the national level in Canada, the Government of Canada has a roadmap for open science that has data sharing elements in it. And then at the funder level in Canada, there are two policy documents to speak of. The first being the Tri-Agency Statement of Principles on Digital Data Management. Tri-Agency referring to the three national research funders in Canada. That's the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. And finally, just released this year, the Tri-Agency Research Data Management Policy, which does not have a data sharing requirement, but it does have a data deposit requirement and encourages data sharing when appropriate. But of course, given the current context, it's worth mentioning the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on data management and sharing policy. There's been a very significant push with some high-level statements to support data sharing. For example, the joint statement on sharing research data and findings relevant to the COVID-19 outbreak. This is building on the statement on data sharing in public health emergencies, which was released in 2016. To date, 160 signatories have signed that joint statement, including publishers, and CIHR has, of course, also signed it. There's also the National Science and Technology Advisors call for open access to COVID-19 publications, but also open access to their underlying data. National Science Technology Advisors or equivalent from 15 countries, including Canada, have signed this document. But of course, with the move towards increasing research data management policies and the unprecedented push to share data during COVID-19, funders are asking themselves various questions in light of these developments. For example, have researchers complied with the policy requirements that the funders have implemented? Are the data fair that researchers are sharing? And lastly, what barriers or gaps present obstacles to researchers in sharing their data? Funders are interested in these questions for various reasons, including rather narrow ones that pertain to their need to track compliance with their policies and the effectiveness of their policies. At a somewhat broader level, funders are interested in understanding the role of their policies in fostering culture change. And I think at an even broader level than that, funders are interested in understanding how to situate their policies within the broader ecosystem of stakeholder policies and practices. And I think this last point pertains especially to this question on barriers and gaps that present obstacles or challenges to researchers sharing their data. So at CIHR, myself and my team have done a little bit of work in trying to look into those questions of policy compliance and so on. As we've done this, we've observed that data availability statements are absolutely essential for us to track compliance with our policies. Developments in technology and the use of DOIs and so on might provide us with other kind of mechanisms and opportunities for tracking compliance with our policies. But at present, we've found that data availability statements are really a key avenue for doing this, in the sense that we will take like a selection of a sample of papers and look into their data availability statements and try to get a sense of whether data is being shared and so on. I won't go into the methodology, but I will say I will relay some of the things that we've observed and throughout this process. The first is that even when data availability statements are required by publishers, which I think many in the audience will know isn't often. In fact, what our findings suggest is that among the samples that we've looked at, data availability statements are required around 50% of the time, but I mean that figure could be way off given the limitations in our studies. But even when they are required by publishers, suboptimal statements are very common. So for example, instead of providing a DOI to the data set, the authors will say things like data is available by request or available in the paper. So for example, in the supplementary materials, and they'll do this instead of providing the persistent identifier that links the data to the data in a repository. Now, in light of these findings, or these observations rather, I would very gently and collegially suggest some policy, policy suggestions to publishers about their journal policies. The first would be that it would be a real benefit, I think, to funders, but also to support broader cultural change, to require data availability statements in all of your journals. That would certainly, I think, help funders when it comes to trying to track, to what extent researchers are actually sharing their data. But I think it could also really help drive things forward in terms of broader cultural change. A second policy suggestion is that when data can be shared, require that authors use persistent identifiers or DOIs. As noted, what we've observed in some of our work in trying to track whether researchers are sharing their data, often in the data availability statement, they say available by request or so on. Naturally, it'd be much more useful and effective if the authors simply required or simply provided the DOI to the data set. And finally, I think what could be useful, it's not exactly policy, but I think it could be useful for publishers or journals to provide guidance on data access or guidance to researchers on best practices when it comes to providing access to their data. So that this could mean, best practice in terms of using a DOI, but also perhaps, and I'm wading into some territory here that I'm not so familiar with because I don't work in the journal and publishing industry, but perhaps, editorial teams and so on could provide guidance within their journal on community expectations as it pertains to what data authors are expected to share, and maybe, if possible, direction on where to go for ethical advice or so on, in terms of understanding what data can be shared. I mean, often researchers go through that as part of the ethics review process at their institutions, but I sense that a fair number of researchers might be, they have hesitations about sharing their data, when those hesitations, whether warranted or not, could perhaps be resolved through different, anonymization and so on of data. But so providing, guidance on best practices on data access and so on could also be quite helpful. And just to conclude, I wanted to say, these comments are really given in the spirit of a belief that policy alignment and complementarity are key to driving broader cultural change towards data sharing. And by this, I mean, when I make such suggestions to journals, it's kind of in light of the requirements that funders are increasingly presenting, and for data sharing and so on, data sharing requirements, and just kind of a recognition that I think ideally what we would like to see is a really aligned and complementary policy landscape where if a researcher needs to is required to share his or her data to comply with a funder requirement, at the journal level, that can be facilitated through, for example, data availability statements, the use of DOIs, guidance where appropriate, and so on. On that subject of policy alignment, I just wanted to conclude by highlighting another session that will be taking place later on in the RDA plenary. And this is a session that the interest group that I co-chair has collaborated on with the Data Policy and Standardization and Implementation Interest Group, as well as the Fair Sharing Interest Group, where we've co-developed this session, which fits into a broader project that we're engaged in on funder-publisher policy alignment and trying to understand where the gaps are and how they can be remedied. So this session takes place on Thursday, November 11th at 1600 UTC. It's on the, you can find the session on the RDA plenary webpage. And if you're available, it'd be great to see you there and to have you join the discussion on what I think is a very important issue. So thank you for your time. I wish I could have been there in person, but unfortunately it was just perhaps the worst possible hour in my part of the world. So thank you, and I wish you a good session.
There we are, with the powers of technology. There was Jeremy, who was hopefully still tucked up in bed.
So I did add Jeremy's email address to the Jamboard, and his colleague Shannon has also provided her email address if anyone wants to get in touch. Again, that was really interesting. It struck me, so I had a question that I would have asked Jeremy that he then answered in the talk, which was, is this the only way that you as a funder are starting to look at data management plan and data policy compliance? So like, is going to a journal and looking at the data availability statement the best way for a funder to know, has the researcher done what they said they were going to do? And it seems as though maybe yes, at the moment it is, which I think is a big opportunity for publishers, right? Okay, so we're going to move on to our discussion. There's a couple of ways we can do this. So I'd encourage you to open your mics and to speak if you'd like to. So just to manage the group, because it's relatively large, if you want to open your mic, you can put your hands up. So on Zoom, let me make sure I have this right, you can click reactions and then raise hand, and then we will invite you to open your mic. If somebody wants to raise their hand and speak, please do so. In the meantime, maybe I will pass over to Ian, and we'll start looking at some of the questions that came through during the session on the Jamboard.
Yep, that works. I'll keep an eye on the attendee list for any hands raised, because we have quite a lot of questions. So we've attempted to start arranging them into some common themes, I think. So while we wait to see if anyone has any really burning questions, I have one observation from going back to the first speaker, Lauren, is there were actually several questions relating to the process, I suppose, how it works at PLOS in terms of what is being checked for by who, whether or not that's a specialist task, and also some questions relating to checks on particular kinds of repository and checks on things like data citation. So I wondered if, Lauren, you could try and give a brief summary of what goes on behind the scenes for PLOS to answer a few of those together.
Sure. The checks that we do at PLOS are, I guess, fairly more on the technical side of things rather than the best practice data side of things. So it's stuff like, is there a DOI? Does that DOI work? Is there data, somewhere in that link? We're not checking for things like, are the full data there? So is everything that's needed to reproduce that article contained within the repository? We're not checking to see whether the most appropriate repository is used, that kind of thing. We do check for data citations, I think it's some of the journals, and make sure that the kind of data that's referenced in the data availability statement is in the reference list. It might seem a bit kind of at odds with our open science mission that we are doing kind of minimal checks around data sharing, especially when we're trying to advance open science. But I really think that's to do with the kind of the costs around checking the data availability statements. It's, as I mentioned in the talk, it's, one second, give me a second, just please. It takes, already about 20 minutes for our operations teams to check just the statements, see that they work, and I think further, those specialist checks of course costs money, and I think there's a tension where do you pass that cost to? Do you add it to the APCs? No one wants to pay higher fees for publishing. Do you pass it on to the peer reviewers who are already kind of overworked and doing jobs for free, so they probably don't want to do that? Do you try and encourage early career researchers to get involved in data checking? But then that has costs around training those early career researchers, making sure that they have enough knowledge to do the data checking, and keeping that pool of early career researchers sustainable, because of course they will move on in their career and need replacing. Or, do we look more towards institution and funders to try and provide better training for researchers, so actually that they don't know, or so that rather they do know where they should be putting their data, so actually we perhaps don't need to check because the skills and knowledge is already there in the institutions. And I know, having come from working in an institution in a data management role, that actually there are tensions in that system as well, in terms of where there is scope for extra training. So I think at PLOS we've kind of settled on a kind of compromise where we are encouraging everyone to share data and try and get everyone up to that kind of minimum level of sharing data. And now that we're working on pushing towards best practice for researchers. I hope that covers most of the points.
Yep, thank you. I will move on to another question. Sorry, also keeping one eye on the chat and the hands up reactions. So we'll try and make sure that there's at least one question about each of the talks, because there are many questions about all of the talks. Jade, there's a few on yours. these questions are less about what the publisher is doing and more about what the authors are doing, I suppose, and how we can guide the authors. So the one that I'll pose to you is, do you think that many authors are drafting a data availability statement for the first time when they publish at IOP? I suppose bearing in mind that this was a pilot you described at 3 journals initially. So perhaps you could tell us your thoughts on how the authors are responding and what happens when they give you different kinds of responses.
Yeah, so during the pilot, we did see a lot of confusion from authors about how best to construct differences. Quite often, if they had provided a statement, sometimes that was at odds with what they'd chosen on the submission form. So they weren't just copying and pasting from the statement we were giving them, they were then trying to construct something that said something slightly different. I think we've moved on from there, and I think it is very community dependent. I think it probably was a mix of some authors. It might have been the first time that they were having to write such a statement in a manuscript. I think some of it was just they weren't aware that we'd introduced the policy, and so actually increasing that visibility to the policy and the reminders and the mitigation that we did really helped. But we are seeing that it is community dependent, and we're seeing that in the uptake of the statements and how much sharing is going on now that we've kind of automated the process and rolled that out across the journals. In that in some communities, data sharing practices aren't well established, and so we've got some way to go in terms of kind of trying to increase that. And I think the data management plans, as that becomes more, as it comes from the ground up, as more funders demand data availability statements and data management plans, and as they become more used to doing that, I think the capability from authors to write comprehensive data availability statements will increase. But then of course you've got the if we allowed them to freeform it, then you've got issues then with text mining and being able to, for funders then to be able to know whether they are sufficiently doing what was mandated in the funding. So it's a kind of catch-22 situation in terms of allowing authors to freeform the statements versus the standardization that kind of as an industry that we might prefer.
Thank you. I will steadily move on to a question for Yasushi and Ritsuko. So there are a lot of questions about DMPs. So I'm going to try and form a general thematic question about a few of the things here and see what your response is. So there's a lot of things asking about what goes into DMPs and the extent to which there is information that might also go into a published paper. So I suppose I will pose the question, Yasushi, is what do you think the optimal relationship is between a DMP and what goes into a paper? What would you like to see provided in those documents so that it's useful for your needs? What would you like to see there?
Well, thank you for excellent wrap up of the many questions I have. So I think first of all, the relation between DMP and the data availability statement might be something like a cause and effect. So okay, so starting from the research project plan, then the data management plan connects the research plan and data that's produced. Now, the part of those data are published in an article, and in that article, and the data availability statement describes where the dates are. So it can be it's a flow of the research all the way down to the publication. So in that sense, I don't think DMP and data availability statement has to be tightly aligned to each other in format. But it's better to be understandable as a cause and effect. So the plans are in the DMP and results are in the availability statement. So I hope we will have be able to know the logical relationship between the DMP and the WT statement. I think this could be an answer to your question. Ritsuko, do you have anything to add?
Just fine with your answer.
Okay, thank you for that response. We have someone with their hand raised. Bertrain is what I can see in the handle name. But do you want to come off mic and ask your question, please?
Yes, actually, my name is Emma. That's my first name, my last name. Sorry. It's actually a general question. So thank you so much for all of this information. It's been enlightening. I am new to the field of publishing, so this is fantastic for me. I find that all of these questions are very general, but the propensity of authors to share data is also field specific. So for instance, geosciences is already a big tradition of sharing all the data that you produce in repositories that have been used for decades at this point. Is there anything to learn from those more like cultural habits from those communities to implement to, for instance, what Jade was explaining about how authors are sometimes confused about what it is to share data and why you should share data? I don't know. I was wondering what your thoughts in general to every speaker were about this.
Thank you. Jade, would you like to give some thoughts on that question about cultural differences?
Yeah, and I think that's the baseline that we're trying to determine is the different disciplines, so that we, like you said, we can go to those disciplines and see where they're sharing the data and what we can learn from those communities to try and benefit those that maybe are a bit more reluctant or maybe aren't as used to, you know, what can we learn from them. And I think, you know, speaking to we're a big fan of speaking to our customers, and I think actually going to those communities, and we went to our editorial boards on the pilot journals, you know, to listen to their thoughts and to what was going on in that community, and that from there we identified those journals from speaking to them. So I think we can learn from the communities and what's working there, and where that culture's come from of sharing data so openly, and how we can transfer that to other communities. I think it's really important.
Thank you. We've had a shout out from Daniela in the chat that there is a working group on discipline specific guidance for data management plans. Briefly, Lauren, did you have a quick response to that question?
Yeah, I was just going to add to Jay's point that I think it's really it's a really good way to encourage data sharing in other disciplines, is to find the people that, say, earth sciences collaborate with, and then kind of view it as a sort of a chain to work your way down with. So you start with the disciplines that are closest to those ones who are sharing data openly and can perhaps relate to those types of data or those types of methods or experiments, and demonstrate how it's being really done well in this kind of very close discipline or the discipline that they naturally collaborate with, and kind of work your way out there. I think if we think about research as an increasingly collaborative and interdisciplinary endeavor, I think there is a really good opportunity to exploit those kind of networks of collaboration and kind of spread out those open data kind of good vibes and messages from those kind of clusters of research that are doing it really well and have been doing so for a long time.
That's really clever. Thank you.
So again, I'm going to maybe combine one or two questions together, and Yasushi and Ritsuko, as Jeremy and CH aren't here to answer a question on behalf of funding agencies, then I come back to you again. So there's a more general question here around whether publishers should be doing something more about DMPs, and also a general question about, from a funder's perspective, what would it be useful for publishers to do to support your needs? So we'll ask those together. So whether it is about doing more with DMPs or something else, what would you as a funding agency like to see publishers do more of to help with the kinds of tasks that you've been describing in your talk earlier?
That's a difficult question. Let's see. In JST's case, actually we do not mandate the data publication, so it's only a recommendation, and only for the underlying data of the published article. So having that said, so all we care is together with the article, the underlying data goes public. Now, I think the question is how we can judge or we can encourage authors to do so. I don't have a solid idea on that, so it might be another question to publishers. Do you have any standard methods to judge the data availability is enough or not? And I think Jade or Lauren has mentioned already, but maybe, you know, I think it's not, may not be funders' role to check that. And so what is the publisher's perspective on that? So, but if the publisher checks that aspect, then we don't have to, worry about that, because, the publication means complying to our policy. So that's the ideal world. So what is your perspective, publishers?
So yeah, I was going to any of the publishers in the room, speakers and others who I recognize as well, in terms of the publisher's role. And I think I interpreted that, Yasushi, is determining whether the data are shared or not, and whether it's all of the necessary data. I think that seems to be sort of more generically what you were describing, you were trying to find out. And so I think thoughts from the publishers on the publisher's role in checking that all the data have been shared, checking whether all the data have been shared.
Just one comment. I think the word underlying data or evidence data, that themselves are vague. Actually, we do not know what's the definition of the underlying data or relevant data for the findings. So, well, that could be another issue if we discuss about this topic.
Okay, Rebecca, you've got your hand raised, and I realize we're pushing close to time as well, but you also represent a publisher, so maybe have a response.
Yes, so from the F1000 perspective, so yes, we do like really intensive data checks, but I've been reviewing our data guidelines over the past couple of weeks, and I do think we could be clearer about what exactly we're checking, and like maybe that would be very useful to funders to know, well, if an author is publishing here, this is what you can expect to be checked. But yes, I realize you only have 3 minutes left. So I think probably we won't get to another question, right?
No.
So this has been a really useful discussion. I think we have some kind of draft notes, but maybe after this session, I'll go in and maybe write some kind of summing up of some of what I think the key themes emerging were, which to me were around things like being able to analyze data availability statements, how they can be used, whether they're currently being used. That was a question I had. Is anyone analyzing these? And if so, how? And then, as I said at the start, a recording of the session will be available. We shared the slides, we'll share the notes. If anyone isn't a member of the policy group currently, we'll probably share them on our mailing list. So it might be a good idea to join up with our group just so that you're on our list. Ian, anything to add before we close, or Natasha?
Just to say that the recording will be available initially to attendees and then ultimately on YouTube, but we'll go back over that and use that to tidy up some of the notes and produce something a little bit more comprehensive and share with everybody in due course.
And also just to remind people about the funder publisher alignment, policy alignment session that's happening later in the plenary.
Yes, thanks, Natasha. So that's happening think it's 4 o'clock UTC on the 11th of November. Okay, so to close, I'd just like to say really big thanks to our speakers. So I could see the presentations were excellent. You all put in a lot of work, so very much appreciated, and an excellent start to the plenary. So an excellent start to Breakout 1. Thank you all very much, and to our participants as well.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.